Madam Special Representative, you recently visited Ethiopia. What were your discussions there?
For the last 2 years, the EU was engaged with the Ethiopian government basically on three baskets, as we call it. One was cessation of hostilities, ceasefire to end the war, access to have humanitarian access to Tigray and to northern Ethiopia, and the third one is accountability. We've made it very clear that we hugely appreciate the pace with which the ceasefire has been signed, but also implemented. I think this is incredible that there has not been a single shot fired since the signatory. So I think this and humanitarian access, I think they're moving quite fast. What we were discussing since January, basically, is the question of accountability. What kind of accountability system are the Ethiopians looking at, both sides, both parties to the war? And of course, to us, it's really about the victims. It needs to be a victim-based justice system, transitional justice system. So for the last couple of months, we were discussing, of course, with the Minister of Justice, whom we met, and with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, but of course also with the UN OHCHR, with the UN Human Rights Council, because we feel very strongly that an independent body needs to play a role in, establishing basically the justice basis, the evidence basis, and the monitoring, the humanitarian and human rights monitoring on the ground.
The Biden administration has determined that war crimes have been committed in northern Ethiopia, and they believe that it's been committed by all sides in this conflict, and not just in the Tigray region, but also in neighboring regions. What is your assessment of the Biden administration's determination here?
I think what is necessary right now is to see how we can take these next steps with the Ethiopians, where the Ethiopians made it very clear, both sides, that they agree on a transitional justice system in conjunction with the African Union. So we would need this now to be implemented. The Ethiopians have started consultations with the population, with the society, but I think it also takes that next steps with the OHCHR to have these international components. So, reflecting on what the findings are, what the findings will be, that there is a justice system that can really also deliver and show the victims and show the families of the victims, that it's not just the end of the shooting, it's not just the end of the war, but that justice is taken serious.
Speaking of taking justice serious, can transitional justice really be achieved in Ethiopia? We talked about seriousness here. Are both sides equally serious, not just about the peace deal and not just about the cessation of hostilities, but also seeing real justice for the victims?
I think this is where the question of accountability comes in right now. And I think accountability can really only come for your own population, for your own society. And I think what we've seen after this very cruel conflict, this very cruel war, is more and more people calling their authorities to be accountable for justice. So I'm quite hopeful that transitional justice, that justice can be done, and that there is room and scope in Ethiopia for this necessary, the justice part, but the transitional justice part in terms of reconciliation, in terms of truth dialogue, that all of this can happen. And this is in the making, but I think, the implementation now counts.
Well, I'm sure a big part of your visit is also about the very relationship between Brussels and Addis as well. What is the nature of that relationship now?
I would say we always kept relations, but of course for us, we stopped budget support with the beginning of the war. What is becoming very clear, and this is, where the EU and EU member states have a huge interest, as you know, in terms of trade relation, Germany, the EU, other member states are basically number 2 and 3 of trade relations with Ethiopia. So this is the investment, the interest in keeping and re-engaging with Ethiopia. We need Ethiopia to play a regional role. I think this region is quite important to us as Europeans. The Red Sea is basically our trade route, is important for our LNG, energy diversification. So the aim is really to re-engage, to have this strategic relationship back again. And I think this is where we hope that the Ethiopians can take those steps. And of course, we're very hopeful that, also coming back to the economic reform agenda that we've seen before, I'm quite hopeful and very positive after our, relations and the visits of our foreign ministers of some of the member states. I think we're building up, but of course, it's really that question of how do we come back to the development cooperation? I mean, the humanitarian aid was ongoing, but development cooperation was also ongoing in specific sectors, but how are we coming back to basically normalize this relation? And I think this is where the steps we talked about in terms of accountability are important, but I'm quite optimistic that we're getting there.
How does the EU see the role of another player that was part of this conflict, and that is Eritrea? How do you see the role of Eritrea, and what can the EU do to help improve people-to-people relationships in the region?
The Horn of Africa initiative, funded also by the EU, but World Bank and others as well, started in the 2018 peace agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And I think to me, this is really what I would like to come back to. Regional economic integration, people-to-people contacts across borders between Ethiopia and Eritrea, between Ethiopia and Sudan. This will take time because I think, the question of trust, the question of accountability needs to be solved first. But I think if you look at the region as a larger component, as a region that needs to grow together, that needs to be stronger, I think the region needs to grow in interconnecting itself. To become a region, you need trade relations. You need relationship where basically your people, your societies can travel. Mobility is important. I think this is where the region is engaging further and further. We, as many other countries, we have never stopped talking to Eritrea. But of course, the question is, how much is Eritrea willing to also play a positive and constructive role in the region, but of course also in regards to the accountability question in Ethiopia.
I want to get back to transitional justice. How do you see that? Or what would that look like in Ethiopia? Could we see a tribunal like we did in Rwanda after the genocide, or a peace and reconciliation, a truth and reconciliation commission like the one we saw in South Africa? And especially given Ethiopia's track record with trying to establish these sort of reconciliation commissions and attempts at reconciliation. How do you see that playing out in the country?
I think it's a very big shift in the Ethiopian history, because as in all the changes in Ethiopia, reconciliation and truth, transitional justice at large was not really the full focus. I think we see a shift in this and the seriousness in this from both sides, but how it's going to look like in specific is something that they try to work out right now with the consultations. Now, the question will be, of course, is the justice part in transitional justice remain? I mean, how big is the justice part in the transitional justice? They are looking into different models from the continent, as you already, referred to Rwanda or South Africa, but they're also looking into models of, Colombia and other places in the world. How is that working somewhere else? How can you bring basically such a big issue into 120 million country with 120 million people? How can you bring this as part of the national dialogue as the third step of transitional justice, as they're looking into it right now? But I think this is also where the clarity needs to come from the Ministry of Justice in terms of how is the criminal investigation? Is it going to be an independent body? What kind of mechanisms are they looking at? But I think they're working on this right now in a serious way. But of course, it's going to be a huge effort to bring this kind of transitional justice, truth-telling, reconciliation into the society that is very not used to this, to this format.
Right, and often these efforts take longer often than the conflict did itself. Ma'am, the EU has been playing a wide-ranging role in development, infrastructure, and humanitarian areas in Ethiopia. How has the war affected those efforts, and what can you tell the people of Ethiopia they can expect in terms of this kind of support from the European Union?
I mean, we want to come back, to this relation, to this support. As we've talked about it before, we stopped the budget support, but we didn't stop our relations. We continued with development. We continued with people support, but we would like to come back to normalization. I think we would like to come back in terms of having our companies investing, having our relations with the government, where we can come back to budget support, where we can come back into a long-term planning. Because of course the war has affected everything. I mean, the economy is totally affected by the war. Everything that was supposed to go into investment, into building up an infrastructure, into building up, an industrialization, bringing people from the schools, from the universities into jobs, that has been disrupted massively by the war. This needs to come back. So we do need to see, of course, the reform agenda coming back from the government. And we're willing to come back to this as well. And it really requires movements on the three baskets, especially accountability right now, before we can fully, normalize. But I think we're getting there. It's a gradual approach. But yes, of course, we would like to come back to this normalization. And I think it's something that is doable, it's reachable. But after such a brutal war, it will also take time to come back to the trust, to gaining that trust in the region, to gaining that trust, especially with their own population.